you listen to the noises coming out of the White House, and peace has never been closer. We're really close to a ceasefire. We've nearly got this wrapped up. All it's going to take is one call with Vladimir Putin and we'll get there. Whereas in Europe, there are an awful lot of questions.
And there is something just really uncomfortable about this sort of Yalta-like kind of moment. The great powers as they existed at the time, the USSR, the United States and the British Empire, determining what the new world order is going to be. While Europe and the country which is at the centre of all of this, Ukraine, the country that has been fighting for its freedom for 3 years, are relegated to bystanders, waiting to hear what the outcome of the call is. I mean, it is uncomfortable.
Well, the Trump administration and the White House were consulted by the Israelis on their attacks in Gaza tonight. And as President Trump has made it clear, Hamas, the Houthis, Iran, all those who seek to terrorize not just Israel, but also the United States of America, will see a price to pay. All hell will break loose.
It has been yet another massive 24 hours in world politics. News overnight that the Gaza-Israel ceasefire, in which so much hope was rested, has all but disintegrated, with Israeli airstrikes killing more than 400 people, according to local health officials.
And the ceasefire had been negotiated with the help of the United States. And with the United States support, it looks like it's ending. Just as President Trump is hoping that today he can negotiate another ceasefire, this time between Russia and Ukraine. Welcome to the News Agents. It's John.
It's Lewis.
And it was always going to be difficult to get to phase 2 in the ceasefire plan. But last night it more or less came to an end. It's hard to say that a ceasefire is in place, given the intensity of the Israeli airstrikes, which were targeting Hamas officials, and apparently a number have been killed, but also an awful lot of women and children as well. Hamas so far giving a restrained response, but it looks as though the prospects of peace are dismal. The prospects for the remaining hostages being held who were taken after October the 7th, equally dismal, and the prospect for Gazans starting to rebuild their lives and trying to get back to something that looks like a livelihood, again, dismal.
Yeah, and the Israeli government have been threatening to launch an offensive for some weeks. Israeli officials say that Hamas has not been honouring the terms of the ceasefire, says it hasn't been returning the hostages they promised they would. Hamas dispute this, and the Israelis are saying that the way to get those hostages is to start the campaign of bombing again. Many hostage families in Israel dispute this. Lots of people, of course, pointing to slightly more cynical reasons on behalf of Netanyahu, the Prime Minister. Lots of people have said that he never intended to move to the second stage of the ceasefire because that would have meant Israeli forces withdrawing from Gaza, in effect leaving Hamas there, or what remains of Hamas there. Lots of people saying that he had no intention of doing that. Also, of course, he clearly has the backing of the Trump administration, sees a window in which he can resume the war. And of course, there are domestic political factors as well, which is, of course, as we know, and we've talked about on this show many times, Netanyahu relies upon, if you think, Netanyahu is extreme in terms of his policy, well, he's actually relatively moderate, and it's all relatively moderate by comparison to some of the extremist, uber, hyper-extremist, radical right, hard right, far right forces in the Israeli Knesset, the parliament, on which his government depends. And they have wanted to go faster and further. They never wanted the ceasefire in the first place, and have been saying for a while now, since Trump came back in, look, we've got an even better opportunity to do what we want, which is basically to remove, ethnically cleanse Gazans from the Gaza Strip. And that is something that de facto the US administration, Trump, has actually supported and suggested would be a good idea. So why are we having a ceasefire?
Yeah, so it's not a huge surprise that hostilities have erupted again. And, frankly, there aren't a lot of good policy options for Netanyahu in this whole mix. Pull out of Gaza, withdraw all Israeli forces and see Hamas rebuild, recruit, rearm, and perhaps launch another October the 7th style attack, which is what Hamas have said they would do again and again in their bid to sort of destroy the state of Israel. or you carry on and you bring opprobrium for the sort of attacks that you have launched, which is, of course, what has happened. And there is the whole question of aid getting through to Gaza as well. I suppose, above all of that, though, is the figure of Donald Trump, which seems to be a kind of recurring theme in everything we are talking about right now, because it was Donald Trump who we gave great credit for kind of managing to unlock a ceasefire deal, a month or so back, 2 months ago, when Joe Biden had kind of been labouring for months and months with this and having got absolutely nowhere. And yet Trump managed to pull it off. But it's equally now Trump who is giving the Israelis the green light to go ahead and totally undermine and leave the ceasefire in tatters by saying, yeah, let hell break loose.
Yeah, and of course, it is true that these hostages, there are 59 hostages which are said to still be there, although many think that up to half could be dead.
Yeah.
The reality of what's going to happen now, right, is that the Israeli, if you think that, well, this is it and the ceasefire can resume, that is clearly not going to happen, because the IDF and the Israeli government have made clear that this is just the start of a broader incursion, a broader set of attacks which will take place and continue and sustain until such time as those 59 hostages, or however many are left, are sent back to Israel. Of course, this was all supposed to be part of the agreement, or stage 2 of the agreement, but that, as we say, is now in tatters. And of course, what it means, whoever is in the right, and of course, as ever with this conflict, there's a lot of wrong to go around on every side. The innocents in all of this will, of course, continue to be the civilians, the Gazans, who have been living in hell for pretty much 18 months, who are now looking down the barrel, staring down the barrel of hell resuming day after day after day. And that had already been there to some extent because, of course, we know the humanitarian situation was dire. Food and medicine, which had started to go back into the Gaza Strip, having had a blockade for so long, or certainly not much going in, not as much as was required. There was already, during the ceasefire, Israel had decided a few weeks ago to resume that blockade. They say they've got about 3 weeks worth left of essential humanitarian supplies, medicine and food and so on. And if that blockade is not lifted in the near future, once again, you're going to be looking at the prospect once more of famine and disease and, as I say, hell in the Gaza Strip once again.
Look, the whole situation feels utterly desperate. The humanitarian situation in Gaza, the Israeli families who kind of want to see if it's possible to get their loved ones back and feel that every move by the Israeli government is probably making it less likely that they will be freed and that they will return back to Israel. So the whole situation is desperate. But you were talking about the humanitarian aid there. And it's interesting that, America has been, Israel, do what you need to do what you have to do, just get on with it. But in the House of Commons yesterday, from the Foreign Secretary, there was suddenly a much more noticeable toughening of the government line about what the Israelis were doing and whether it was breaching international law.
Well, my honourable friend is right. This is a breach of international law. Israel, quite rightly, must defend its own security. But we find the lack of aid, it's now been 15 days since aid got into Gaza, unacceptable, hugely alarming and very worrying.
And that happened yesterday, and we were messaging about it last night, saying it's quite a big moment, much more explicit than the government had been hitherto. And yet you fast forward to today, and number 10 spokesperson, rowing back from what David Lammy had said to the House of Commons, saying, which David Lammy, as you heard there, saying that what Israel had done was a breach of international law. PM's official spokesperson saying that the UK government position remains that Israel's actions in Gaza are at a clear risk of a breach, which is clearly different. They say we continue to call on the government of Israel to abide by its international obligations when it comes to humanitarian assistance to the population of Gaza. So very, very unusual and pretty embarrassing for David Lammy, speaking not just anywhere, but at the dispatch box of the House of Commons as the Foreign Secretary for the British government, saying what a lot of people indeed, and a lot of NGOs, humanitarian organisations, and indeed some international institutions have said and have been quite clear about, but Number 10 deciding to slap him down and say that that did not, in effect, represent HMG.
Look, the interesting thing about it, Lewis, was that if you listen to the way Lamy spoke, it wasn't like he got his words mangled.
No.
He knew exactly what he was
deliberate.
saying. It was very deliberate, and he repeated it again during that Commons Questions session. And so Lamy was absolutely clear that this is what he was going to say. Presumably his officials knew he was going to say it. His special advisors, I would have thought, would have cleared it with Number 10 as well. But Number 10 have pushed back and said, I'm intrigued as to the power play that's going on now between the Foreign Office and Number 10 over this, and whether any American involvement has come in to say, whoa, soften that. You need to soften that. You don't want to be saying that about Israel.
Yeah, it does feel like that there is the strong possibility that Number 10, mindful as they are about maintaining influence with Trump about Ukraine, have decided that to step outside and to be seen as being especially critical of Israel, saying that they're defying international law on humanitarian aid, which is a serious charge. To say that and be so at variance to the Trump administration is just not something that they're willing to do, because the Trump administration would take umbrage with it. But of course, since he said that, since he said that in the Commons, this question has become even more acute, right? Because when he said that in the Commons yesterday, the strikes had not happened yet. And so therefore, if these strikes are now going to resume and the war is going to resume, then the humanitarian blockade, which, as I say, had already been in place for some weeks, that becomes an even more serious question than it did even 24 hours ago. So it feels to me like this line, or this difference between Lamy and Number 10 in a British political context, could become quite difficult for Starmer quite quickly.
Just one other consideration, and it may be, if we want to influence Ukraine, we have to stay on side and not be too critical of Israel. The UK wants to stay on side with Israel in terms of intelligence sharing, because Israel has such extensive intelligence networks across the Middle East, where the UK has considerable interests, and therefore I think there too you've got a UK government that doesn't want to kind of burn its bridges too much with Israel at this time, and that as well might explain the kind of Number 10 slapping down of Lamy.
So we should talk a little bit about Ukraine. As I said at the start, this is a big 24 hours of world politics. Donald Trump at the centre of both conflicts in the Middle East and Eastern Europe. We're recording this, and we tried to put it as late as we could, so we could still get the show to you.
I thought that was because you were down the pub.
No, I was actually getting a hot towel shave this morning, John. It's been a very, very hectic morning for me.
You've had a hot towel shave?
I did.
Old school with a kind of open razor.
Tell?
You look gorgeous.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. Oh, you don't get this when Emily's here. No, we wanted to bring it to you as late as possible because we were cognizant of the fact that this much fated call between Trump and Putin was going to be taking place at some point in the afternoon, our time. At the time of recording, which is just after 3:00, reporting from Washington that call has been going on for over an hour between Trump and Putin. But the outlines of what the Russians, at least, want from the Americans were reported on earlier in the day via Bloomberg, including, and to cut a long story short, basically what Putin is demanding, or is said to be demanding, is a suspension of all weapons deliveries to Ukraine during any ceasefire, i.e. that they would not be allowed to rearm during the ceasefire. Of course, the immediate question, if that is the demand, and if it is something that Trump is willing to countenance and willing to allow to go forward, then obviously for the Ukrainians and the Europeans, that is a desperately difficult position, because you potentially lay open the prospect of Ukraine in the ceasefire, for however long it were to endure, not being able to be supported with European or American armaments at exactly the same moment that Putin and Russia will be regrouping and rearming themselves.
And of course, it is such a brilliant move by Vladimir Putin to demand this, because for Donald Trump to agree to that is not very difficult. He doesn't want to give Ukraine any more weapons anyway.
Perfect.
But for the Europeans who want to offer support, and what are you doing? Once again, Putin is driving a wedge between the United States and Europe and Ukraine.
Absolutely.
And it would be tactically brilliant if Putin were able to pull this off. And that is why there is such a sort of, you listen to the noises coming out of the White House, and it's peace has never been closer. We're really close to a ceasefire. We've nearly got this wrapped up. All it's going to take is one call with Vladimir Putin and we'll get there. Whereas in Europe, it's, well, there are an awful lot of questions. We would love to see a ceasefire, but there have to be a lot of assurances. And, you know, I'm sure the other thing that Putin is going to demand is that there are no European troops on the ground policing the ceasefire.
I remember saying on the show a few weeks ago that, you know, the fear, it seemed to me, was that Zelensky was being set up for Hobson's choice, an impossible choice. Either accept the blame for walking away, or accept a white peace, a peace that was unacceptable and likely temporary. And look, Trump may turn around and go, you know what, Putin's playing me here, or Putin's asking for too much. Maybe he will. But if the Bloomberg reporting is right and Trump were to acquiesce to these demands and then basically say, well, there's your deal, fantastic, go ahead with it, then as you say, John, it's absolutely clear what Putin's game and strategy would be. Drive that wedge between Europe and the US, an even bigger one that currently exists at the moment. If Europe and Ukraine accepts, then Ukraine is basically left defenseless as Russia rearms and will have achieved its ultimate aim of defanging Ukraine and attempting to make it a kind of vassal state, because you know what would happen next. There would be elections in Ukraine, and who would be pulling the strings, flooding the Ukrainian zone with disinformation and with interference tactics that we've seen Putin use time and time again in neighbouring states like Georgia, but also in Western states as well. But of course, if they choose the other option, which is to walk away, then Trump is incensed, he's furious, he's enraged, he walks away, there's definitely no more US arms, and Europe and Ukraine have to fight on alone, or at least consider whether they can. And a nightmare for Keir Starmer in particular, if that, we've been saying for weeks, right, that, you know, Starmer might be playing it well in sort of clinging to both sides and being a bridge, but at some point, a moment of rupture would come, and this could well be it.
Yeah, I am sure Putin wants to give Trump something of a victory in this call so that Trump can go, look, I did it, I pulled it off, but at such a heavy price. I mean, what would be interesting is if Putin asks the impossible and Trump says, no way. Because then what does Trump do? What does Trump do if Putin says, well, I'm not going to do this, there's no ceasefire, we're not ready to on these terms, and so, sorry, you know, Donald, it's nice for you to have made this effort, but we're not going to go ahead with it. Then what does Trump do? Because Trump has not been put in that position yet. And, you know, with Vladimir Putin, who he has this extraordinarily odd, weird, deferential relationship with, and the only person he's ever deferential to is Vladimir Putin, what would he do then?
We've seen this sort of roll out or play out a few times over the last few weeks, but there is just something still so uncomfortable about us all waiting on the outcome of a call between these two great powers. Well, in fact, one great power and one pretty lesser power, really, but is being elevated to sort of great power status by Donald Trump.
With a smaller GDP than Italy.
A smaller GDP in Italy, a country which is economically exhausted, is an absolute crummy dictatorship, one that is basically a sort of gangster state, an oligarchic gangster state. It's not even propelled by the kind of ideas that were once behind at least the early stages of the USSR and so on. It's just about Vladimir Putin and the money that he extracts from the Russian people and the cronies around him. But Trump is elevating them up, and there is something just really uncomfortable about this sort of Yalta-like kind of moment. Yalta Conference in 1945, carving up the world between the great powers as they existed at the time, the USSR, the United States and the British empires, determining what the new world order is going to be, while Europe and the country which is at the centre of all of this, Ukraine, the country that has been fighting for its freedom for 3 years, are relegated to bystanders, waiting to hear what the outcome of the call is. I mean, it is uncomfortable.
It's uncomfortable, but you also sense that you know, Trump is much more interested in talking to Vladimir Putin, who he regards as a kind of counterpart of a great power as well. And this may be a trivial point, but his attitude towards Europe, European viewpoints, I thought was crystallised in the White House briefing yesterday, when Caroline Leavitt was asked about some lowly French MEP who'd said that the Statue of Liberty ought to be returned to France, and her response is quite telling.
There is now a member of the European Parliament from France who does not think the U.S. represents the values of the Statue of Liberty anymore. They want the Statue of Liberty back. So is President Trump going to send the Statue of Liberty back to France?
Absolutely not. And my advice to that unnamed low-level French politician would be to remind them that it's only because of the United States of America that the French are not speaking German right now. So they should be very grateful to our great country.
How far back did you go to play that game? I mean, it's only because of France that the United States even exists.
Yeah,
if it were not for the Franco-US alliance of the 1770s, then the American Revolution would not have been successful, because France supplied it, not because it particularly cared about America, but because it wanted to get back at its old rival Britain, supplied it with enormous military aid and financial aid. The United States at that time was the Ukraine of its day, and the United States might do well to remember that sometimes. Also, you know what? This does matter as well. 80 years ago, no one in the Trump administration at the moment helped anybody in the Second World War, right? We've just lost the last member of the few, the last member of the RAF, who was 105. Those guys were the heroes. Those guys in 1940, and all the Americans who came over to liberate Europe in 1944 as well, they were the heroes. No one in the Trump administration was involved.
And also, just, if you're going to go, well, if it wasn't for us, you'd be speaking German. Why don't you just go the whole hog and say they smell of garlic and they're cheese-eating surrender monkeys? It's just a kind of cheap, low-life politics, jingoistic, that you just think, okay, fine at a pub after 3 or 4 pints or on the day of an England-France football match, but this is the bloody White House press spokesman for the president.
2 World Wars and 1 World Cup.
Exactly. I mean, it's just juvenilia that is being dressed up by, some 28-year-old press secretary who knows no better.
Yeah, and all the kind of pathetic alt-right reaction online, talking
good
about
on
the best put down ever. It's pathetic. It's pathetic. This absolute veneration of insulting your allies. And you know what? More than anything else, it is these people accuse, the left, in particular the media, of not representing public opinion. Your average American doesn't like that. They don't. The average American doesn't like it when Canada is being insulted either. This is the Western Alliance more than anything else. It's a group of countries which are actually connected by family and kith and kin and politics. That's always been the basis of it. There's no point in just insulting one another. Countries which actually have so much more in common than what sets us apart. It is risible.
It's fine for the football terraces, not the White House briefing room.
Quite. Got that off our chest, haven't we, John?
Whoa,
what a relief. We'll be back just after this.
I would like her department to be able to look my constituents in the eye when I go back to them to tell them that this is going to work for them, because as things stand, my constituents, my friends, my family are very angry about this, and they do not think this is the kind of action that a Labour government takes.
And I would put that there are alternative, more compassionate ways to balance the books, rather than on the back of sick and disabled people.
Yeah. 3/4 of the people who claim universal credit and disability have gone without essential items in the past 6 months. The £5 billion cut is likely to make that worse for them.
Thousands of the most severely disabled people in my constituency and millions across the UK have watched in disbelief as politicians debate cuts to the support that enables their very survival, leaving many at breaking point, Madam Deputy Speaker. Does the Secretary of State understand the real fear and distress that this has caused?
Even those who are assessed as needing help in every criterion may not be entitled to PIP. Isn't it wrong to balance the books on the backs of the sick and disabled people in such a way?
So that was the House of Commons earlier on today. Labour MP after Labour MP, mainly, though not exclusively from the left of the party, getting up to criticise their own government's plans on welfare reform, which we talked about on the show yesterday. This is Liz Kendall's plans, which she confirmed today, the Work and Pension Secretary, I should say, confirming today that the government is seeking to save some £5 billion by the end of the decade by reducing various forms of benefit, centred in particular on disability or sickness-related payments. So she confirmed today that basically nearly all of the reporting which had taken place in the days leading up to this announcement was pretty much on the money. So plans set out in the Green Paper entail, among other things, the eligibility criteria for personal independence payments, that's PIPs. These are payments which are given to you irrespective of whether you're in work or not, but to help you with disability-related extra costs that you might happen to have, and they're done on in terms of what you get. It's a sort of sliding scale depending on how severe your disability is. But the eligibility criteria for that benefit will be tightened so that people will need to score 4 points in at least one activity which is set out in the eligibility criteria to qualify for the daily living allowance. The government will also consult on frequent reassessment of PIP claimants, although the most severely disabled are expected not to have to be reassessed, and the basic rate of universal credit for those looking for or in work will rise by about £15 a week from April 2026, but the incapacity benefit, so that's the bit related to sickness, which, as I say, the government is really hammering, will be cut for new claimants judged as unfit for work, and there will be more ongoing assessments, more frequent assessments for those people the longer they're claiming that benefit.
And that cut is something like a half almost, isn't it?
Yeah, it's significant.
Yeah, it's a significant cut. And that is going to net £5 billion in terms of savings, which presumably Rachel Reeves has demanded ahead of her spring statement. The question is, what level of opposition is there? I mean, you can hear the voices on the backbenches, and that's why we played them at the top of this section to kind of illustrate it. But what you never know is how many people have been asked by the whips just to keep their voice down on this and that maybe make their representations in private. But one thing that I think has been confirmed is that there will have to be a vote on these proposals, and therefore potentially a significant backbench rebellion could take place. One presumes that if the government business managers have done their work, then they know what the scale of the revolt is going to be and feel comfortable that they are going to be able to see it off, or hopefully have a majority so that they are not dependent on Conservative votes to get something like this through, which of course has a sort of degree of embarrassment and humiliation attached to it.
And look, the government's majority is unassailable. They're going to get these changes through. So it's not a parliamentary question in terms of the numbers. I think there is a question over time about what you might call a kind of political attrition of Labour MPs' tolerance for these sorts of things. As we were saying on the show yesterday, for obvious reasons, Labour MPs don't like doing things like this. Even if they can see the intellectual case for it and the financial case for it, they don't like the idea of taking money away from often, though not always, very often, poor people. It's not what they've gone into politics for. But taken together with other changes that the government has asked for and has come along with, including changes to heating allowance for pensioners, changes to international aid, all of these things, they do have a cost in terms of how MPs are feeling about the government. And over time, my sense talking to Labour MPs is that they want something concrete to be able to go back to their constituents with and be able to say, this is what we've done for our people. Because there is a feeling, and it's not contained just to the left of the Labour Party, there is a feeling that right now what the government is offering its people, what it considers its voters, is thin gruel. And that is not an ideal prospect, even when you're 4 years away from a general election.
Yeah, the other thing about having a huge majority, which, it makes it very easy to get the votes through on any kind of major piece of legislation, because it would take the most phenomenal rebellion for you to fail. But you have got a whole bunch of MPs that in a year or two's time, there will be the has-beens, the people who've been in government and have lost their jobs, and there are those who are the never-will-be's, who are never going to get a job in government. Yeah. And keeping those people on board when they know there is no prospect of putting their bum on the leather seat of a kind of ministerial limo is really difficult.
Let's
now, ministerial limos, really?
No.
Bottom.
Let's not say
Posterior.
Derriere.
Derriere, whatever you're happy with. But, if you can't offer them the sort of tantalising prospect that they're going to become the parliamentary undersecretary in this or that department, and then they could rise eventually to be the Secretary of State and sitting around the cabinet table, that is part of the discipline and incentives and carrots and sticks that you have in the whip's office. When you've got a huge majority and you've got people who are thinking, as you say, Lewis, that it's pretty thin gruel that is being offered up, it makes keeping discipline that much more difficult.
Yeah, and look, we should also say that if you drill down into the figures, 5 billion is, not an inconsiderable amount of money. It is actually less than a fifth of the predicted rise that the OBR says there's going to be on working age benefits, people of working age, the benefits that they would receive. OBR estimates that benefits for working age adults will rise from 48.5 billion in 2023-24, already a very large sum, to 75.7 billion in 29-30. So as I say, 5 billion saving in that projected increase is still less than 20% of that predicted rise. So we're still talking about ballooning costs in terms of this particular element of the welfare state. I mean, just to take personal independence payments alone, and there are a lot of people obviously concerned that PIPs are there to help and do help some of the most vulnerable and heavily disabled people in our society, people who clearly they cannot work. But the number of recipients for PIP is set to rise to over 4 million by 2030. That in itself will add an extra £12 billion to welfare spending. So you can see that when, particularly as the Chancellor is preparing her spring statement in a week or so, these figures are like a kind of vice. It's sort of the walls closing in on her. All of the room to maneuver that she might have is basically constricted and constrained by a welfare bill that is escalating and climbing all of the time, irrespective of, notwithstanding of, the measures announced today.
We talked yesterday on the podcast about how well organised the lobbying groups are, the think tanks and everybody else against any moves against welfare, and how so many of the Labour MPs who've risen up through the ranks have come from that particular route themselves. And I think what you're describing there with those numbers is actually a very modest change in terms of welfare reform, given the ballooning budget. Yet it feels at the moment from the reporting that this is absolutely huge what the government is announcing. And yet, not a drop in the ocean, it's more than that. £5 billion is a lot of money. But at the same time, compared to what the welfare budget is, it is relatively small.
And obviously it's a lot for any individual who has their,
of course,
their benefits change. But I think sort of part of my frustration with this, just sort of engaging with it politically, is that, look, I mean, clearly on current trends, the welfare budget is spiralling out of control, and particularly with regards to working age benefits. Obviously the biggest actual component of that is pension costs, but the government isn't going to change that. So looking at the other side of the ledger, it's working age benefits. But I suppose the problem with, I think this is kind of what a lot of Labour MPs deep down worry about, the problem with changing benefits in isolation is that benefits are the thing that you do as the state when something else has gone wrong. Take housing benefit as an example. Why does the government pay housing benefit? It pays a housing benefit because there aren't enough houses, social homes, or indeed houses which are affordable to rent on an average or less than average or low wage, right? And so the state has to basically top up people's rent or top up people's housing spend because they just wouldn't be able to afford what the house would cost on their own, right? Because we've got a housing problem. So you can change housing benefit, sure. I'm not proposing to do that today, but just as an example, you can change housing benefit. But unless you change the root problem, the root cause, which is the lack of affordable housing, then all you're doing is making people poorer. Likewise, if you're changing working age benefits, and working age benefits often kick in because the wages that people are receiving, even though they're in work in the private sector, are just so low that they are not commensurate with the high costs of housing or of food or of childcare or whatever it happens to be. So again, the state has to basically step in and top up their income. So to change benefits, fine, but if you're not going to address the structural causes which lead benefits to be necessary in the first place, then all you're going to do is immiserate. All you're going to do is make people poorer. So I think it's absolutely fine and right to change the benefit system, and there is obviously evidence as well of perverse incentives going on, and in particular, seeing so many young people not be in work at such a crucial time of life. It's going to scar them. It's going to ruin their entire professional lives. There's nothing Labour about that. There's nothing left-wing about that or right-wing. That's just common sense. No one should want to see that. But you've got to address the structural reasons why so many benefits are necessary in the first place. I mean, to take housing benefit, we spent £16 billion on housing benefit last year. £16 billion. That's just going straight into the pockets of landlords and so on because the housing market is so bust. £16 billion is more than we spend on the Home Office, the Ministry of Justice, the Department for Transport. Benefits very often are a thing the government does to try and just take the worst edges off, the worst excesses off a system which has failed. But we've got to look at the system itself.
We will be back in just a moment. Some people might say that too many books are published, and
no one said about any of your books.
No, of course not.
Surely
mine.
Not. No,
and it's not an excuse for me to talk about my book. I would never ever want that to happen.
No.
Look, there is
Just remind us of the title.
No, there is there is a new book out called "The End of an Era: The Decline and Fall of the Tory Party," and the publishers promise us that it is a book that tells a searingly honest tale in its appraisal of the failings of the British political class over recent decades. It's written by a guy who spent most of his time on the backbenches, stopped being an MP in 2019, and you think, well, why would anyone be interested in this particular book? And it's interesting for one particular reason, that the MP of the time, Mark Field, happened to have an affair with one Liz Truss. So forget the searingly honest tale. This is a bonk buster.
Okay, I said you weren't allowed to say bum, let alone bonk buster.
It's a bonk buster.
What next? Wild romps?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's still to come. We're only just starting this conversation.
This can't be right. Do you ever say bonk buster on the 10 o'clock news?
No, I don't think I ever did, to be honest. No. But I mean, look.
How would that have gone down, do you reckon?
Badly. But look, this is a book that seems to have been written. He's got one story to tell.
Yeah, but what a story.
Yeah.
You're going to be reading it.
Obviously, he
Did they ask you to do the blurb?
Yeah, this is a way. What's the selling point of the book?
I can see. You're going to be on the front cover of the paperback now. An absolute bonk buster.
Okay, I used the phrase bonk buster. Forgive me. I just think there's something slightly squalid about writing a book 20 years after you had this relationship with Liz Truss. A dalliance, whatever you want to call it, whatever the correct form of words is, affair, leads to the breakup of his marriage, and what, it's like you're trying to cash in on something. You're no longer getting attention.
I bet he never thought he would be able to cash in on it, to be fair, I suppose.
I mean, it almost...
Life comes at you fast.
It almost, and I'm going to say this, and I can't believe I'm going to say it, it almost makes you feel sorry for Liz Truss, because what on earth is this? She having to put up with this for her kids, for her husband, all the rest of it.
Well, Mark Field's End of an Era, The Decline and Fall of the Tory Party is out now at all good and bad bookshops.
We'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.